All right, good morning. We will start shortly. Sorry for the delay in getting started. We just had a drill get started at our office, but we're moving ahead. So we're just going to give about 30 seconds, let folks get in, and we'll get started.
School plan, and then I have the template that the template in doc tracking calls it the school.
All right, good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. This is Bonnie McFarland. Welcome to our, let's see, where are we? April meeting, only coming toward the end of the year. So this is our April State and Federal Programs Directors Meeting. Our full team is here with us today. Rachel Garcia, Jeannie Keith, Adrian Balcazar, Debbie Cano, and also Helen Choi and Anita Lomeli, who some of you have met through your LCAP meetings with them. And also supporting us today are our assistants, Christine Young and Anna Cordero. So the full team is here to assist you. And in addition, we have a guest joining us, Dr. Michelle Pernaud from our System of Support for Expanded Learning office here at LACO. And she is here to share some updates and her expertise on the Expanded Learning Opportunities program. So let's take a look at today's agenda. First is going to be Dr. Pernaud on the ELOP update. Then we're going to talk a little bit about just an overview on ranking and serving Title I schools. It's getting close to that time of year. We'll have an update on some of the free and reduced lunch, free and reduced meal data collections and how they are going to be impacted in the coming year. A few LCAP reminders, again, that's getting close now. And also in the chat for the last few months, we've had one of our charter friends ask us, are you going to help us out? And so, yes, we will be talking about some support available for our charter school friends. We'll have an update on federal program monitoring from Adrian, our FPM lead, and then just a review of some of the other year-end evaluations that are coming up. Just a reminder, in the chat, you'll find a list of the resources, any handouts from the meeting. The link will be posted. The link is there to the PowerPoint, but you will also find when we're finished, slightly afterward, you'll find also a list of a link to the recording. You can also find all our previous meeting handouts and links to recordings there. So here's where after the meeting, we will have a Q&A sent out. So we ask you if you could put your questions in the chat. Again, as we say, your questions are sometimes very challenging, need a little bit of work to research, and we want to make sure we're correct. So we send out a Q&A afterward. It'll be posted on our website, as will all our previous Q&As. So you can find that all there. All right. So I think without further ado, I will introduce a good friend and colleague. Michelle Pernaud works just down the hall from us. And fortunately, the Expanded Learning Opportunities program has given us a chance to get to know her better. And we lean on her because she has a lot of expertise in that area. And we know this has been a program that's had a lot of confusions along the way. And so Michelle offered to come and join us today and give us an update. Michelle, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. You have the slides that I will cover. I will cover some of them rather quickly because they're informative to you, but don't require us to go deep. So first thing I'd like to start with, though, is to say that expanded learning has a definition and it is found in Ed Code. And so to help with some of the confusion that's out there, I'm going to cover this intentionally. Expanded learning means before school, after school, summer, or intersession learning programs that focus on developing the academic, social, emotional, and physical needs and interests of pupils through hands-on engaging learning experiences. Now, here's the thing to focus on as well. It's the intent of legislature that expanded learning programs are pupil-centered, results-driven, include community partners, and complement, but do not replicate learning activities in the regular school day and school year. So that's just to set the stage for how expanded learning is defined in Ed Code, and that when we see funding come out and it talks about expanded learning, those funding sources refer back to this definition. When we look at expanded learning opportunities program, the ELOP intent, it's that all local education agencies offer all unduplicated pupils in classroom-based instructional programs access to comprehensive after-school and intersessional expanded learning opportunities. And again, you see that noted there in Ed Code. So I'm going to dive into that a little deeper in a bit here, but I want to give you just a little bit more framing. So on the next slide, we're going to take a look at the statewide system of support for expanded learning. What's important to know is that since 2002, there has been a statewide system of support for expanded learning. And it starts, we come through CSESA, of course, and then Michael Funk is the division director, and I'm sure many of you have heard his name. He has been out and about doing road shows, helping people to also understand what ELOP is. From there, then there are 16 county offices of education that are funded with technical assistance dollars for ACES in 21st century. That's really where expanded learning began, and the dollars of flow began for expanded learning programs and technical assistance provision. So with that, there's a team at CDE. I have a team here at LACO, and money flows through CSESA into our region. So now we are providing universal technical assistance to all LEAs and grantees who are funded with ACES and or 21st century, and certainly then with the addition of ELOP funding as well. And we do focus on before school, after school, intersession, and summer. Let's take a look at the next slide. I know that there's been like, wow, there's a lot of money out there. There really is. When we looked at ACES in 21st century funding, what we knew is that there was approximately about $900 million. Well, this year we grew substantially, especially when we consider the money that came in for ELOG being substantial as well. But when we look specifically at ELOP, currently in this current fiscal year, we have an additional $1.75 billion. That's a significant amount of money that is coming in to support students to have opportunities in expanded learning opportunities. With May Revise, we are all waiting to see if indeed an additional $2.65 billion will be added to the budget, taking us up now to, I want to say $4.4 billion for this next fiscal year. So again, that's a substantial amount of money that really truly allows all LEAs and charters that are receiving these monies to really increase opportunities if they already have funding in ACES in 21st, and or to actually create new programs at their sites. And we'll dig into that. The rest of the information on this slide, of course, is specific to Los Angeles County, just to help you understand how those funds are coming into the county across each of those funding sources. So let's take a look at some information that I think you'll find helpful, considering some of the confusion that's out there. So unduplicated pupils, this is definitely defined when we look at ELOP, and we're looking at students that are classified as English learners, eligible for free or reduced meals, and also our foster youth. Additionally, when we look at ELOP, we have student enrollment requirements. And what's interesting here is there's a UP percentage, a UPP percentage. It's either greater than 80% or it's less than 80%. And that's right now. With May Revise, it is suggested that that may move to 75%, greater than 75 or less than 75. But at this time, it's 80%. So on this slide, we are specifically looking at information about those that are equal or greater than 80%. So in 21-22, the statute requires LEAs to offer the ELOP to all TK-K6 classroom-based unduplicated pupils and to provide program access to at least 50% of enrolled TK-K6 classroom-based unduplicated pupils. Now, there is flexibility right now, especially with 21, 22, there's an understanding that ELOP plans, they need to be planned for and developed. So for folks that have ACES and 21st century programs, they are more easily probably able to start providing services right away. And for those that don't and just are, finding out about ELOP, there's a lot of planning that goes into that, including planning not only with folks at the school, parents, students, community partners, et cetera. But just want to draw attention to this information here. So yes, planning is important. Providing services are also important. There's a significant amount of money that you are able to roll, of course, this money forward into the 22-23 fiscal year. It will end at that point. So just planning. They're not funding a planning year, if you will. It really is about planning and moving into providing services. When you look also here, that 80%, when we start looking at 22-23, which is right around the corner here, it's to offer ELOP to all TK6 classroom-based pupils and to offer access to all students. That's the shift between 21-22 into 22-23. So that is to offer is, it's important that everybody has an enrollment form for students. Every student, if that can be a part of when parents and guardians are registering their student for school instructional based learning, there should be an enrollment form that hopefully folks will be filling out for that expanded learning opportunity program, because that helps get to the must be able to offer. Access then is actually providing the program, and that's where we get to the 50%. Moving on, just knowing that the attendance requirement, it really is based on student need here. For those of you who are familiar with ACES and 21st, there's a requirement of time, et cetera. But when we look at ELOP, it's really based on the need of the family and the student. That next slide just shows that for LEAs less than 79% UPP, this deck is really crazy. It keeps moving, sorry. Back one more. There you go. The 79.99%, this just helps you to understand, for those of you that have a UPP percentage less, then in 22-23, the goal, of course, is to offer to all. However, program access to 50% instead of 100% if you're over 80. All right, we'll move on then to your existing requirements. If you have ACES in 21st century, here's the important thing about moving forward into program right now, is that programs will be able to offer a single comprehensive program and be able to count the attendance of ACES and 21st century students right into their ELOP program. So it'll be easier, I think, for those folks to move into program implementation, continue to plan, of course. Now, student to staff ratio, if you're going to be serving TK and K students and utilizing ELOP funding, the student to staff ratio is 10-1. It's 20-1 if you're only using ACES and or 21st century. That's important differentiation there. And then, of course, it is 20-1 always with ACES and 21st, and ELOP if it's grades 1st through 6th. Number of days for operation. Here we're looking at every school day, 175, and an additional 30 summer/intersession days. So that's important to note as well. Now let's look at your program hours with your school days. So on school days, must provide in-person before or after school expanded learning opportunities when you add it to the daily instructional minutes. From the time the bell rings, first bell, to the end, let's say that that's 5.5 hours. Then the expanded learning program would need to offer for the remainder of hours to get to 9. So 5.5 from 9 equals 3.5 hours. The program would operate 9 to get to 9 hours a day, including instructional time and expanded learning. When we look at summer, same thing, we'll be offering 9 hours of in-person expanded learning opportunities per day. And what's important to know is that the calendar year for these activities starts July 1 and ends June 30th. So a lot of people are offering summer programs in June rolling over through July. But please note that July 1 is the start date, June 30th, of course, is the stop. So you would start counting for 22-23 starting July 1, even if you've been offering programs in June, activities in June for summer. So you have July 1 through June 30th for your 30 summer/intersession days to be calculated. All right, on the next slide, program elements. A lot of folks are like, okay, we can use this money to do anything. That's not necessarily the case. In regards to ELOP, it's to be very much ACES alike. And so ACES alike means that there's an inclusion of an educational element, an enrichment element, that there is all types of things occurring, right down to snack, physical activity, etc. So these program elements are required for folks that will be utilizing their ELOP funds. So that's all LEAs. There's no opt-out here. Receiving the funds, no opt-out. So it is really important to come together and plan around how these activities or this part of the requirements will be a part of the program plan guide. Now, moving on to the next slide about the program plan guide. And there's an additional attachment for folks, of course, to consider. All LEAs must complete a program plan template. And the program plan template covers the quality standards that are required in expanded learning programs. In the state of California, we have 12. And in this template, they cover 11. Sustainability is not one that's covered. So they also cover 3 additional questions. And that is, for programs that are existing with ACES in 21st, how will you combine a comprehensive program? An additional question is, how will you be offering programming specific to TK and K, especially considering that the ratio is different, it's 1:10 instead of 1:20. So that will require additional staffing and different materials, facility, space, etc. And then providing a sample schedule as a part of the template so that folks will be able to clearly understand how will you be addressing 11 of the 12 standards for quality in a program, and how will you then be helping the folks that will be reviewing this understand how your comprehensive program will be scheduled and will work through. Now, in this next slide, I have given you some questions to consider around engagement and alignment. LEAs and charters utilizing their ELOP funds, whether with or not an ACES and 21st Century program, will want to be sure to consider how will they engage and align with one another. So I won't cover these questions, but just want you to have them so that if you're in conversation with folks around confusion or where do I start, this would be very helpful, I think, for folks considering starting to have their conversations. When we move on to the next slide, I wanted to just share with you regarding the technical assistance unit. We're here to provide support to you. So in regards to consultation, facilitation, providing and brokering resources, coaching, and professional development, all of these are available to you at no cost. So please do visit the website listed there underneath the picture on the right-hand side. You can set up a free account and you can take advantage of any of the opportunities that we are offering, and certainly reach out to us if you need additional support. The last slide, there are resources here that are available to you around ELOP. So the state is offering office hours. There are fireside chats to help people learn more. The documents that I talked to briefly in this PowerPoint deck, all of those are linked here for you. Additionally, with the 22-23 proposals, and while we're waiting for the May revised information to come out, it's important to know until that comes out, until we know that legislation is going to change, it's going to look different. What stands currently is what people should be planning for. And where I think it's important to pay the closest attention is if you are at an 80% UPP, if you're close in percentage, or if you're really close in the 75, which is proposed in the May revise, those folks in particular need to be paying very close attention. It is certainly offered to all, but providing access, it's very different providing access to 50% versus 100%. And what does that look like? So additional planning may be necessary there as well. All right, that covers the slide deck.
Michelle, I am so sorry. I don't know what's happening, but they keep advancing. So I apologize to you and to everyone.
I don't know either, but you know what? Everybody's going to get the deck, and so that's good news.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, you ever had one of those tech days, huh? Doesn't cooperate. Thanks so much, Michelle, not just for being here today, but for providing all those resources and being there to support districts. I can tell this is going to be ongoing, and the questions are going to continue to evolve as people begin to implement. There are a number of questions in the chat, and Michelle has agreed to assist us in getting the right answers to those questions. And some of them are good questions and some that are going to take some expertise. So thanks, Michelle. Really appreciate your time. All right, so now we're moving on. We'll see if this keeps flying. So we'll fly through Title I ranking and serving. We want to spend some time on this topic because we are finding that there is a lot of misunderstanding on the topic, and it's resulting in Title I funds not being allocated correctly or in a timely manner. And we're getting questions coming to us that indicate that. In addition to the influx of federal funds that you've gotten in the last couple of years, issues with allocating funds contributes to excess carryover. If schools don't have those funds, they don't plan, they don't spend them, the students don't get services, and you have excess carryover. So it triggers a lot of issues. Confusion over Title I eligibility and funding also contribute to, and this is a serious concern of schools not taking the planning process seriously. If they don't have funds in time to do a thorough planning process, and it's just throwing money at things is kind of what they see it as. So it's a huge problem in terms of Title I planning, which also shows up in FPM. So we're going to review this again. We're just going to go over this now to kind of get you started. But when we do our consolidated application workshop, hopefully in June, unless things get delayed, we want to make you aware of some of the requirements right now, and we'll go more in depth in it in June, because as we know, it takes a while to kind of have this make total sense and actually do the ranking. There are specific federal requirements governing how funds are allocated to school sites, and we put the Code of Federal Regulations there that specifically address school allocations. So it's not, there is a requirement. Sometimes new directors just think, well, just kind of everybody gets it, or first come, first serve. No, there are requirements. So let's take a look at some of those on the next slide. All right, so we districts allocating funds to schools, again, it's outlined in something called ranking and serving, okay? And that's what's referred to in the law. Ranking and serving is designed to support the underlying purpose of Title I. And the purpose of Title I is to provide additional supplemental funds to schools with high concentrations of students, and then to use those funds to provide supplemental academic supports to students who are not achieving, to low achieving students, to help reduce the achievement gap. So that's the purpose, and ranking and serving is at the heart of it. So ranking schools based on poverty is the first step. Now this applies to districts with, or LEAs, with 1,000 or more students. So given that most charters don't have 1,000 or more students at a single site, it doesn't apply to charters. Also, it doesn't apply to charters because the funds go directly to the charter school. So as opposed to going to a district that has multiple schools, they go to the charter if they're direct funded charters. If the charter is under the district, then the funds should be allocated by the district through the ranking and serving rules. Districts need to maintain notification of documentation of school notification. So they need to annually rank schools, notify the districts of their allocations. CDE has put together a really helpful website, and there's a link here to their website, and it goes through the ranking requirements. It's called Title I School Allocations is the name of it if you're searching for it on the website, but it's very helpful and provides a summary of the requirements. Also, we wanted to share this right now because the U.S. Department of Education just recently, last month, they released a draft of non-regulatory guidance for within district allocations under Title I. And it takes the place of the previous guidance that was under let me see, NCLB. I almost forgot about NCLB there, but anyway, it was under the previous authorization. It's been updated and it includes things like community eligibility, but it was posted as a draft for public comment, but I believe the public comment period has been completed, and so it should be posted soon, but we have it on our website with the other handouts, so you can get it there, but you can also get it at the link on the slide. All right, next slide. Let's look at the purpose. Why do we do this ranking and surveying? Well, number one, it's to identify what schools are eligible for Title I funding. There's eligibility criteria. That's part of the ranking. The other is to determine school level allocations. How much is going to each of the schools? And keep in mind that 85% of Title I funds per California Ed Code has to go for direct services to students at school sites. And this is reviewed through the FPM process. So you'll find that in the FPM instrument. It's also the purpose is to ensure that Title I funds are allocated to schools with the highest poverty, the highest concentration of poverty. And that was the whole idea under Title I when it first was authorized in 1965, that we saw lots of schools with lots and lots of poor children, and we wanted to send the money there. But once the money gets there, the funds are used to support students with academic needs. So the funds go based on poverty, services go based on academic need. And also the purpose of ranking and surveying annually is to provide schools with funding amounts for planning purposes so they can develop their school plans for student achievement. So that's why we do ranking and surveying. Next slide. Why is this so confusing when we do it? Well, it's confusing because of our state system. And that's because school allocations are documented in the February consolidated application winter submission based on these federal requirements. So most of you did that. Some of you did it twice because we had that Title I reduction in funding, but you did the school allocations, you put them in the consolidated application in February. But that's not when you should be allocating schools, but there's no trigger in the CON-App to do that. So you're just reporting it in February, but schools need to be notified at the beginning of the year so they can, or even sooner than that, ideally, so they can develop a plan, they can develop a budget, and so services get started, start of the school year instead of not starting till partway through the year. So let's take a look at how you do that and what you can do now to get started. Why are we talking about it now? Well, first of all, you can use your currently certified CalPADS 2021, your fall free and reduced price meal numbers for age 5 through 17. You'll find that, get that report and get that data to determine your school poverty levels. This is the same data you're going to see in next February's CON-App when you report them. So use the data that you have available now. And that's why we use prior year data, because you don't have next year's data now. You have only 2021 data. That's what you have to use. Then follow the ranking rules, and you can take a look at the CDE webpage. You can also follow what was in the consolidated application, school allocation pages to help you, but just follow those rules and on your own, just determine if your any schools, this is kind of to give your district a heads up. Number one, are any schools that are currently funded going to be ineligible next year? You don't want to wait till the last minute to notify them. They need to wind down those programs and be prepared not to have that funding if they're not going to be eligible. The other thing you want to know, are there any new schools that are going to be eligible, and what decisions are you going to make about funding those? Do you have new schools coming in? So again, you can see that if you look at those numbers and just apply the ranking rules, you'll get a sense of any new schools, any schools that are going to fall out of ranking. And the third one is you want to start thinking about what's your district cutoff point for serving eligible schools. As we'll see later, you don't have to serve every eligible school. So you want to think about what's the amount of money that can actually make a difference in a school, and where do we start running out of money in our ranking? For some districts that have very high poverty, a few schools will take up that money if you do it right. So we'll look at the rules, but you need to think about where are we going to cut off schools, because not every eligible school necessarily gets served. All right, next slide. What do you do next? Well, after you've ranked your schools, then you want to estimate your 22-23 school level funding. And so you can't wait till money is final, because money never seems to be final. It keeps changing throughout the year. Budgets are based on estimates to begin with, and schools need to be aware of that what you're getting initially is an estimated budget that could change throughout the year. But how do you estimate it? Use, to be conservative, use an 85% of your current year LEA funding. And that's because Title I has a hold harmless rule that in most cases it maintains LEAs at 85, 90, or 95% of current year funding. This is unless you have a precipitous decline in your particular poverty counts, or if there is a precipitous decline in federal funding. And we usually get a hint of that early on. Our friend at CDE, usually they give us a heads up if they see that going down in the current year. Because remember, Congress allocates the funds in the prior year. So they allocated them last fall. So you should be receiving at a minimum 85, and those numbers are based on your poverty. A very high poverty district would be held at 95% hold harmless, whereas a lower poverty district would be at 85%. So you can take an estimate, use current years or 85% to be safe. Next, you can inform any schools, whoops, back off, I'm sorry, back to the previous one. I'm sorry, I said next, didn't I? Next, you would inform any schools that are not going to be eligible for 22-23. You want to let them know. If you take a look and you say this school is not going to be eligible, you want to let them know now. Then the other thing you want to consider is your carryover. Your business office should be able to give you an estimate of your current year carryover, and you know if you're going to spend a lot of that money down during the summer. You got big summer school programs, but if you're going to have considerable carryover as of September 30th, you want to figure that into the amount that's going to be available, and then determine how it's going to be reallocated. Are you going to send it back to the schools? How are you going to do that? But that could affect funding. Next, you want to support any newly identified schools. If you see some schools that are going to be eligible, it looks to you like you're going to be funding them, you want to help them get started with school site councils, with school plans. Again, you want schools to hit the ground running with this program when school starts. Then you can provide schools with estimated funding amounts for planning purposes, so their school plans can be revised or developed if they're new for the coming year. And tell these schools that these are estimates. Okay, they need to know this isn't a fixed amount, but based on that, they need to prioritize their needs based on their needs assessment. Probably a school's got more needs than they can fulfill, so they should plan for that and prioritize them so they can either add things. Yeah, we already talked about this, but our estimated budget wouldn't have allowed it. But now it looks like we're getting more funds. You might find that out later in the year. We can add more hours to this. We can do whatever it is we already decided on. So you don't have to go back every time that you get additional funds and make decisions. They also need to know what they have to cut back on if something happens. If we really had to give something up, what would it be? So we always tell schools, plan for more, plan for less, be nimble, and schools that are nimble and know their needs can move fast and get those services going to students. Next slide. Now we'll take a look at the fact this estimate thing again, and it came up with the reduction in Title I funding. That's because Title I estimated entitlements, they're usually posted in August, and they're usually called estimated entitlements. But because they're posted, you can feel a little more comfortable with that than you did with your estimate based on the 85%. So based on that, if you choose, a district can update your schools. If that's significantly different, if you may be estimated at the minimum 85% and you got significantly more, you might want to update, inform your schools and have them start looking at their plan and making revisions. Allocations then are often updated in the fall. So if you watch the CDE website, then what you're going to see is that periodically they're posted. We try and send something out and let you know if we see that they're updated. So keep checking to see if the amounts are updated throughout the year and if it's significant. And do you want your schools to go back, or do you want them to hold off until February, which is when the CONAP is released? And the CONAP uses a term like final entitlements, which is a little deceptive because they're final as of February. And that's what it's documented. That's how you allocate the funds out to schools in the consolidated application. But those quote final entitlements sometimes change throughout the year. But for FPM purposes, school plan budgets are reviewed based on the CONAP to assure those two match. The reason for that is transparency, so the public can see that, yes, the school is getting the amount that was allocated based on the consolidated application. We point out to CDE that that can be problematic because those numbers change, but that's what's reviewed for FPM purposes. But keep in mind, this isn't the end, and that's what a few districts found out this year. They suddenly, when the revisions came up with the reduction in funding from 2020-21, they found that their entitlements were higher than they were aware of. And that's because after February, Title I funds still continue to be adjusted. Sometimes that's because new or closing charter schools impact it. There are a lot of things at the state level that sometimes affect that funding. So school plans, to avoid excess carryover, you want to make sure that you're watching that money. So you don't want to surprise that there's money there you could have been spending you didn't know about. School plans have to go back to the board for approval whenever there are material changes. Material changes is not defined in law, but it's significant. It's something that, would somebody ask a question about that? Like, where's all that money coming from? Or why did we have so much money for this? So it's essentially a rule of thumb. If you're going to get questions about it, if someone's going to ask a question, you should have informed your board, but not defined in law. All right, now let's look at other factors affecting your school level funding. Just keep in the back of your mind, federal transferability. That's also documented in the winter consolidated application, but you need to determine if you're going to do that at the beginning of the year. So the question is, are you planning to transfer any Title II or Title IV funds into Title I? And if you are, how much will that be? And how are they going to be used? And if they're going to be allocated out to sites, or are they going to be used for district reservations? If they're out, you need to include that in your thinking when you allocate the funds. Again, we talked about carryover. For Title I, you have options how you deal with carryover. Carryover can remain at the sites. And so if a school doesn't spend it, then you can add it to the next year. Carryover can be pulled back to the district and pooled and then reallocated to all your sites. And sometimes districts do that when they have certain sites that continually don't spend their money. So they pool the carryover and it goes out to all the sites. Or it can be pooled and some or all of it can be used for district reservations. We have a little glitch that some of you experienced on the consolidated application, that it only allows you to allocate 15% out to schools of your carryover, even with a waiver. So again, we're working with CDE to say, wait a minute, what if they want to allocate all their carryover out there to the schools? You should be able to do that, but how's that reflected in the content, right? So again, these decisions can impact school allocation. So just keep them in mind. The other thing to keep in mind on the next slide are reservations. And there are two types of reservations: required reservations and what they call authorized reservations. Required reservations, these are taken prior to allocating your funds to the schools, and funds have to be reserved for these. Equitable services, that comes off the top as a reservation. Parent-family engagement, for any LEAs that get over $500,000, there's a required reservation for parent and family engagement. And then for homeless youth, there's also required reservations. So those you have to take off the top before you allocate the money out. There are other authorized reservations. These are the mays. They may reserve things for, and the first one's primarily for county office community day school programs, but that's an option. Financial incentives for teachers in your CSI, ATSI schools. Of course, administration, I love they put that as a may. Administrative costs are indirect, but it's capped at 15%. That's a state law. And then any other authorized activities, preschool, early childhood, school improvement, other authorized reservations. So you pull those off the top before you allocate the funds out. However, the note at the bottom is critical. All reservations except for indirect costs must be for direct services at Title I schools. So they're all direct services. And except for administrative costs, all of them must be direct services to students at Title I schools. So keep in mind, administration is direct administration. It's for directly supporting the program. But reservations, people talk about district-wide reservations. That's only if all your schools are Title I. Otherwise, you can only use the reservations at Title I schools. Next, poverty data options. There are options for collecting it. Most everyone uses free and reduced price meal information, but there are other options, one being a feeder pattern for secondary schools. So just know there are options, but almost everyone uses the free and reduced meal from CalPADS. The year, and this is from the guidance that's put out, it says an LEA uses the most recently available data, which will be from the previous school year in most cases. That's directly from the guidance. People have questioned that. Why am I using prior year? Because you should be allocating the funds at the beginning of the year before you have your new numbers for your poverty numbers in CalPADS. Okay? There is an exception for newly authorized charter schools, but again, they don't do rankings, so it particularly doesn't apply. Next, we'll look at allocating the funds. They have to be allocated in rank order based on poverty data. You have to use the same poverty measure for all your schools. So whichever of those you choose, you have to use it for all of them. Districts have to allocate funds in rank order to all their schools above 75% before they serve any other schools. So you have to look at all schools over 75, they have to be funded in order. So if you have schools at 90, 80%, you have to fund those first in rank order. Then from whatever funds remain, you can rank your schools. And another option you have is for high schools. You can push them to the head of the line if you wish. After you've funded your 75% poverty schools, you can jump to high schools that are between 50 and 75%, but that's an option. You don't have to do that. 75%, not an option. And a school is eligible for funding if its poverty percentage is as high as the district average. So LEAs aren't required to fund all schools. As we said earlier, they should be sufficient to support a program of sufficient size, scope, and quality to have a likelihood of success. If your school programs aren't moving the needle for your low achieving students, you may not be putting enough money out there to have a viable program. So think about it. It's not just sprinkling money around. Per pupil amounts can vary at your schools. Most districts use the same per pupil amount, but you don't have to. However, the caveat is a lower poverty school can't be funded at a higher per pupil amount than a higher poverty school. Just keep in mind what Title I is all about, getting that money to your highest poverty schools, and that makes sense. We can't give a higher per pupil to a school with fewer low-income students. All right, remaining options. Grade span option. When you're looking at your numbers now, you might consider that. If you can either use grade span or you can rank your schools district-wide. And grade span option gives you gives the district a choice to where they focus those funds. So you can, after you've served your 75% poverty schools, then you can decide, am I going to put all my schools in a row district-wide and rank them that way? Am I going to put them by grade span? Sometimes we hear districts are frustrated because they have a needy school and somehow it falls out of ranking, or they want to put more money there, it's lower. Try grade span ranking. Sometimes that makes a difference in which schools are going to be funded. LEAs have discretion. You can serve your schools if you have a low poverty level. If you're down at or below 35%, you can serve your schools with at least 35% poverty. But if you serve any school under 35% poverty, this 125% rule kicks in. And what that means is you have to serve all your schools at 125% of the LEAs per low-income child amount. How's that work? What happens is you have to do that before you take any reservation, including indirect and administrative costs. So you have to allocate. In most cases, that would mean allocating all the funds out and not having perhaps as much for your admin and indirect costs. All right. The last one I'm not going to spend much time on, but it's an option, and that's for on the next slide is community eligibility, which is addressed in the guidance. So if you have community eligibility schools, you may want to take a look at that. As you know, community eligibility schools have a certain minimum number of free and reduced lunch students that they have, and then they can serve all students. And they're not required for federal purposes to collect poverty data every year. They can do it once and then they use it for 4 years. However, and the guidance from the department gives you instructions how to rank schools if you have some CEP schools, some non-CEP. However, in California, because we need free and reduced meal data annually for LCFF purposes, it's probably not going to be an issue for your schools, but it is there for you to read. So just some 1, 2, 3s to think about to get a head start on ranking and serving. We'll go into detail in the CONAP workshop, but remember, you don't rank and send your money to schools in February. It needs to be at the beginning of the school year so they can hit the ground running with a great program for kids. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to talk about more about free and reduced meal data.
Thank you, Bonnie. Good morning, everyone. So next, we just have a few important reminders regarding the collection of meal applications and alternative income information forms for the 2022-23 school year. And this information was also shared last week at the CDE State and Federal Program Directors Meeting. Next slide, please. So CalPADS Flash 220 was sent on March 25th and provides information on the National School Lunch Program meal application and alternative income form requirements for the 2022-23 school year. If you have not seen this flash, we strongly recommend that you read it, as it provides a lot of helpful information, and the link is included on the slide. But the flash basically explains what forms the LEAs must collect for the 2022-23 school year for the California Universal Meals Program and for LCFF purposes. So as you know, Assembly Bill 130 established the California Universal Meals Program, which beginning in the 2022-23 school year requires all schools serving students in grades K through 12 to provide 2 free meals. So that would be breakfast and lunch during each school day to students requesting a meal. And this is regardless of the student's free or reduced price meal eligibility, and also regardless of whether or not the school is participating in the federal National School Lunch Program or the school breakfast program. So the California Universal Meals Program is meant to supplement the federal school nutrition programs. So CDE will reimburse eligible LEAs for the difference between the federal paid and reduced price meal reimbursement and the free rate, as long as the LEA participates in both the National School Lunch Program and the school breakfast program. Additionally, on or before June 30th, 2022, LEAs participating in a federal meals program are required to apply to operate under a federal provision, such as the community eligibility provision or provision 2 or 3 for any high poverty schools within the LEA. Next slide, please. So CDE put together this chart that explains which forms will be required for the 2022-23 school year based on the type of school. So if we take a look at the first row, a school not participating in the National School Lunch Program is prohibited from collecting meal applications because they are not participating in the National School Lunch Program. However, they must collect the alternative household income forms on an annual basis to determine students' free or reduced price meal eligibility for the purposes of LCFF. For a school that is participating in the National School Lunch Program that is not on one of the federal provisions, they must annually collect meal applications for the California Universal Meals Program, as well as for purposes of LCFF. So these schools may also collect the alternative income forms, but it is optional, and it's in addition to the National School Lunch Program meal application. So again, for non-provision schools participating in the National School Lunch Program, it's mandatory to collect the meal applications annually. Next slide, please. So next, for community eligibility provision schools, or CEP schools, they are prohibited from collecting meal applications. For LCFF purposes, CEP schools need to collect the alternative household income forms in the LCFF base year, and then would not have to recollect the alternative income forms for any student that remains continuously enrolled until the next LCFF base year. However, in non-base years, the alternative income forms would need to be collected once from new or incoming transfer students in order for those students to be counted in the unduplicated pupil count. For provision 2 or 3 schools, LEAs must collect meal applications in that provision base year, but they are prohibited from collecting meal applications again until the next provision base year. And then in the non-base years, the alternative income forms would need to be collected once from new or incoming transfer students for LCFF purposes. Next slide, please. So to facilitate the collection of alternative income forms, the CDE is allowing LEAs to collect this form now as part of the spring enrollment process for the 2022-23 school year. However, keep in mind that although LEAs can collect the alternative income forms now, when you submit the information to CalPADS, the start date for the free or reduced price meal records must be dated on or after July 1st to be counted in the unduplicated pupil count. Another important note is that this only applies to the collection of the alternative income forms. Unlike the new flexibility provided for collecting alternative income forms, LEAs must continue to collect federal meal applications on or after July 1st, 2022. So again, meal applications may not be collected prior to July 1st, 2022 for the 2022-23 school year. And lastly, the messaging to families of the importance of submitting these forms is really critical. Since families know that all students may receive free meals without submitting any applications or forms, LEAs should develop a communications plan that informs parents and students of the importance of turning in meal applications and the alternative income forms. And so LEAs can emphasize that the completion of these forms may bring significant additional funds to the school site, as well as qualify students for individual benefits, such as college application waivers, AP and IB testing fee waivers, and also PEBT benefits. So again, this messaging is really, really critical. And that concludes my section. So I will now turn it over to Jeannie for some LCAP reminders.
Thanks, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. If you can go to the next slide, please, Adrian. Thanks so much. So we wanted to take some time this morning to address some questions we've received regarding the new requirement for concentration grant districts receiving the increased 15% in funding for increased staffing to provide direct services at school sites with greater than 55% enrollment of unduplicated pupils. It's important to note that this 15% is part of the overall apportionment that the LEA receives to increase or improve services for the target student groups. And the descriptions in the increased improved services section connect to all of the contributing actions included in the LCAP that are increasing or improving services for the target students. And these increases and improvements in services are in proportion to the additional funding provided for the LEA's English learners, low income and foster youth in the LCAP year. So in 22-23, in the 22-23 LCAP, LEAs with enrollment that is greater than 55% unduplicated pupils are identifying the amount of the additional 15% concentration grant add-on. And they must provide an additional description in this section to explain how the LEA is planning to use this funding to increase the number of staff who provide direct services to students in the coming year at schools that have greater than 55% unduplicated pupils. These staff must be certificated and/or classified staff, which may include custodial staff, and they must be employed by the LEA. The description must identify the goal and the action numbers in the LCAP that are meeting the requirement to increase staffing for direct services at these schools with high enrollments of unduplicated students. Actions that are identified to provide this additional staffing that are LEA-wide or school-wide would also be described in prompt 1 so that the LEA would explain how they are principally directed to and effective for English learners, low income, and or foster youth. If the actions are being provided on a limited basis, they would also be included in the description for prompt 2, addressing how the LEA is increasing or improving services by at least the percentage calculated for the LCAP year. So if you go on to the next slide, we wanted to clarify the inclusion of the descriptions in the increased or improved services section. So we reached out to CDE for clarification regarding this concentration grant add-on funding and the descriptions required to address how the LEA plans to increase or improve services for its unduplicated pupils in grades TK through 12 as compared to all students. And the response provided by CDE indicates that the actions the LEA identifies using the additional 15% concentration grant add-on to increase the number of staff providing direct services to students at these sites with high enrollment of unduplicated pupils must also provide a description of how the action is contributing to the requirement to increase or improve services for those students. And this would be included in prompts 1 and prompts 2. Going on to the next slide, we also reached out to CDE for clarification regarding carryover that may be calculated beginning this year. And specifically, if carryover is related to any unspent funds that are required to be used for direct services. So if there's carryover that's calculated related to the 15% concentration grant add-on funding, what are the requirements? So the response CDE provided is very clear. The funds provided to increase staff providing direct services may only be used for the intended purposes, or the intended purpose, excuse me. If these funds were not used this year, they must be tracked so they can be used for the required purpose in the upcoming year. They cannot be used to provide services other than for additional staffing employed by the LEA for direct services to students at schools with an unduplicated enrollment that is greater than 55%. It's important to note that while this year, for the first time, carryover is calculated based on the estimated actuals included in the contributing annual update table, the carryover calculation only totals the unspent funds for all of the contributing actions together. So an LEA needs to determine locally how they can track the use of the 15% carryover funds in order to identify the correct amount of funding that will be used for direct services at their high unduplicated pupil count sites in the 22-23 LCAP. A planning caution is included on this slide. For example, if an LEA did not use all of their 15% additional funds this year, they need to identify actions using the increased 15% projected for the 2022-23 LCAP year and the amount of unused funding from the concentration grant add-on funding that was unspent in the current LCAP. Next slide, please. Here we shift to provide a reminder about the local indicators. And the local indicators LEAs must complete to measure progress on state priorities where metrics are not collected by the state. And LEAs are required to report on these local metrics and annually based on their locally collected data. This local data collection for the local indicators addresses the priority areas for basic services and conditions, implementation of state standards, parent and family engagement, school climate, and access to a broad course of study. The last two local indicators listed on the slide only apply to county offices of education. We remind you that the local indicator tools and supporting resources that we have provided previously are included in our LCAP Day 3 training, which is posted on our website. These local indicators must be presented to the board at the same meeting at which the LCAP and the budget are adopted. And if we go on to the next slide, we can see in the timeline for LCAP development that the local indicators are included in this timeline. As we've been meeting with district teams, we have reviewed the LCAP development timeline in order to determine that the district is on track to meet the consultation and educational partner meeting requirements prior to taking their plans to public hearing and for board adoption. LEA's responses in the Engaging Educational Partners section should address all of their process that is occurring throughout the year to engage and consult with all required educational partners, and specifically explain how the LEA's process for engaging educational partners included the requirements identified in this timeline. The timeline provided on the slide also includes the reminder about the local indicators, which we just discussed, which must be presented to the board at the same meeting the LCAP and budget are adopted. Additionally, included in red is our recommendation that the LEAs submit their draft for pre-review so our team can provide feedback in a timely manner so it can be addressed prior to taking the plan for board adoption. And at the bottom of the slide is a reminder that not later than 5 days after the adoption of the LCAP, the governing board of the school district shall file the LCAP with the county superintendent of schools. And what that means is that the LCAP should be submitted to ELCAP so that it can be moved forward for COE review and approval. And next, Debbie is going to address some LCAP support for charter schools.
Thanks, Jeannie. So we have had numerous requests from charter schools for support with their LCAP. And so we're happy to share that we have planned to provide this support, and it's just dedicated to our charter schools specifically. So who should attend? Our charter school administrators and those individuals or teams that are responsible for the development of the 22-23 LCAP. What will be shared? We will review the 22-23 requirements and highlight any changes in the LCAP. We will provide resources to help ensure you meet all of the legal requirements of the LCAP, and we'll provide you with a self-review tool to use to guide your development and your review of your own plan. When or where will the meeting be? We're going to host 2 virtual sessions to give folks options for attendance. So these sessions will share the same information, so you only have to attend one. So please select the date and time that fits your schedule best. You'll not miss information from one of the other sessions from the Q&A, because we will merge those Q&As from both sessions and send out to all attendees after both sessions have been completed. And how do you sign up? Of course, there's no fee to attend. And like our other events, you're going to just use the link to register, and the Zoom link will be sent directly to your email. So we look forward to supporting our charter schools, and we'll see you then. May 3rd or May 5th. May 3rd is 3 to 4 o'clock, and May 5th is 10 to 11. Thank you. And now Adrian's going to share some important FPM information.
Thank you, Debbie. Good morning, everyone. Today, we're going to take a look at some updates about FPM. Well, CDE announced last week the districts and charter schools that have been selected for a federal program monitoring review for next year. Cycle A districts are listed here in the first column. These districts will have an on-site FPM review. And on the right column, the districts and charters in Cycle C cohort have been selected for an online review. So you can take a look here if you didn't know, now you do. So here's the timeline for the districts and charter schools that have been selected for next year's FPM reviews. So last week, the CDE notified the superintendents, and they asked the LEAs to complete the web-based LEA scheduling and information request. And it was due this past Monday, April 25th. And so the information that is requested is asking for the name of your FPM review coordinator and dates of your 22-23 school year, including your holidays. And this information is needed in order to inform the CDE about your specific local factors when to be considered when they're scheduling the 22-23 FPM reviews. Then at the end of May, you'll be informed regarding what the specific details about your review. So here you would be notified of the schedule in terms of the date, which programs are going to be reviewed, and which school sites are selected for review in addition to the district. In June, the program monitoring instruments will be released, and they're released for everyone, not just for those that are being reviewed next year, and they will be posted on CDE's website. Information regarding the training opportunities will also be announced at this time, which is a virtual training that will be scheduled for the first week in August. Now, let's take a look at the current year's FPM. The spring 2022 quarterly reporting cycle just closed on April 19th. The reporting included all the federal stimulus funds, and this is used in the FPM reviews for the CARES Act Federal Stimulus Monitoring Program. Also, the annual reporting will take place next month from May 2nd to May 20th. So because this is happening now, and I'm sure it's on everyone's radar, we're going to take some time to share some findings of non-compliance items in the federal stimulus monitoring program from the LA County FPM reviews that have taken place so far this school year. There are 11 items in this review instrument. Collectively, there were findings in 8 out of the 11 items. So we're going to take a look at these 8 findings because I think it's important for you to really see what is being looked at and how the requirements must be followed and what happens if they're not. So starting with, and they call it CARES Act, even though the instrument title is Federal Stimulus Monitoring Program. So in CA1, this is relating to the time and effort requirements. One finding was that there was no time and effort records for specific employees that were charged to the Title II or Title III funds and program. The resolution was that the district had to submit the missing documents for review. And if the reviewer found that they did not meet the federal requirements, then the district would have to transfer the unrestricted funds to reimburse Title II and Title III. And so you're going to see this is the kind of the common solution or resolution for requirements in any of these items not being followed. The range of reimbursement for this particular item ranged from $100,000 to $600,000 in ESSER 2 and 3 funds to be reimbursed. In CA2, this looks at procedures and internal controls. And so the item looks at the policies and procedures in place. It looks for the conflict of interest policy. And so there were findings regarding the policies and procedures that they did not include all the federal requirements, or a district had no conflict of interest policy. And then also specifically, there was a missing component in that conflict of interest policy with the disciplinary actions not stated and how it would be applied for violations to the conflict of interest. And then procurement procedures were missing required elements. So the resolution would update the conflict of interest policy to include all federal requirements. Would also conflict, a conflict of interest policy must include that missing element, which is the disciplinary actions that would take place for violations. And lastly, to revise the procurement policy and procedures to include all required elements. In CA4 procurement, the LEA has to follow the procedures and the procurement policies. And so for this particular one, there was a finding for contracts that the procurement procedures were not followed for specific contracts. And so and also another finding was the district did not demonstrate it used the arm's length bargaining and received a fair price for its contracts. So again, it's important that if you're in the program side, it's critical that you meet with your procurement department as well as your fiscal department to ensure that all of your procedures are in place and that they're followed. And so the resolution for this is if it was the submitted documentation did not meet the federal requirements, you would be required to transfer any funds back to the ESSER or the GEAR funds. The next finding in CA5 is the equipment inventory. And the finding here was that there were expenditures in the general ledger that included purchases over $500 with stimulus money, but they were not included on the district's equipment inventory list. So the resolution for this would be to revise the LEA's equipment inventory list to include all of those additional equipment purchases over $500 that utilize the federal stimulus funds. In CA6, we have this one, it pertains to construction and renovations. So a district was found out of compliance because they didn't follow the state and federal construction and renovation requirements. And so the reimbursement for this finding could be possibly $200,000 to $1 million of reimbursement. In CA9, this pertains to reporting. So a finding of non-compliance occurred when the LEA's general ledger did not match the expenditures that were reported to CDE. So the resolution for this was in the next reporting period, the LEA had to report all of the federal stimulus expenditures and make sure that they matched the general ledger and then submit it for documentation review by the FPM reviewer. In CA9, program requirements for the Corona Relief Fund, there was a finding in terms of there was no documentation to substantiate the expenditures that were in excess of that rule of $500 per student threshold. Also, some expenditures were not allowable in accordance with the CR federal and state requirements. So the documentation would need to be reviewed by the reviewer. And again, if it was not allowable or deemed unallowable, then it would have to be reimbursed. So the resolution of reimbursement to these funds could range from $300 to $100,000. So moving on to the last item, which is the CA11, and this was looking at the program requirements for ESSER 1, 2, and 3. So if there was a notice non-compliance finding for a district that was unable to substantiate an expenditure using the ESSER funds, there was also another finding because there was a missing learning loss evaluation that was not included. And then also a district was found because the safe return to in-person and continuity of services had not been updated within the 6-month requirement, and it was not posted on the website. So again, the resolution could possibly mean reimbursement of funds, and then also for the safe return and in-person continuity, as well as the learning loss evaluation, the information must be updated and posted on the website. So now we're going to switch gears to, we're going to focus on year-end evaluations. Year-end evaluations are required in many of your programs. It must be done for your school plan activities, as well as for your Title I, Title II, 3, and 4 programs. It must also be done as part of your LEA parent engagement policy, as well as your school site parent engagement policy. And it must also take place with your equitable services in your nonprofit private schools. In the compensatory education FPM instrument, CE19 directly addresses the year-end evaluation at the school site. A program evaluation must be completed for school-wide programs for single school districts and charters that are using their LCAP in lieu of the SIPSA, as well as targeted assistance school programs. There are 2 specific evidence requests in CE19. The first request of evidence is for programs that have a school site council. Here, you must have records showing the school site council's involvement in evaluating the effectiveness of the Title I Part A funded programs and services that are included in the SIPSA. So these records would include agendas, meeting minutes, and sign-in sheets. The second evidence that is requested is an evaluation report and the evidence used to determine the effectiveness of Title I funded activities. And it should identify what's working or not working and the inclusion of the modifications that were made to improve services. So specifically for a school-wide program, you must include the evaluation documents completed by the school site council. And for a task program, you must include progress monitoring and program revision documentation. So CDE created and shared the sample evidence-based evaluation template. You can find this template. We provided the link on the last slide of this template, but you can also find it posted on our webpage. This sample template includes the 5 components of the evaluation process. Here you'll see the first column with the goal, the action, service, or strategy, the question, what is working, what is not working, and what modifications will be made based on the results of the evaluation. Using those 5 components of the evaluation process, here is a sample of how you would conduct a quantitative evaluation. And there are guiding questions to use with your school site council, such as what data are you using to drive this conversation and discussion? Here's a sample of how you would conduct a qualitative evaluation. And again, these guiding questions are sentence frames that allow you to structure your questions to specifically align to the activities or services being provided. This slide shows the continuation of that qualitative evaluation. And as you can see, there are many activities within this parent engagement action. Now this part, remember in CE 19, the second evidence requested was an evaluation report and the evidence used to determine the effectiveness of Title I funded activities. So this is a sample of the evaluation report, and the previous slides were your evidence that was used to determine the effectiveness of your Title I funded activities in your SIPSA. And you can see the link for this sample template. And now Bonnie will continue with the other year-end evaluation reminders.
Thanks, Adrienne. Yeah, as Adrienne mentioned, there are other program requirements and other evaluations required annually. So let's take a look on the next slide at the first one. This is one that often gets missed, and it's embedded in the legal assurances that your superintendent agreed to or when they signed the CONAP. So the spring CONAP has legal assurances that have to be approved, and one of those in there is that the results of an annual evaluation demonstrate the LEA and each participating schools are implementing consolidated programs that are not of low effectiveness under criteria established by the local governing board. This requirement's been around for a long time. The only place we see it is showing up in the FPM instrument is in the Comp Ed instrument. However, it really does apply to all your programs. So the question is, Title I and Title III have some pretty specific evaluation requirements, but how does your LEA evaluate the effectiveness of other programs, specifically Title II and Title IV, which aren't quite as detailed? And how's that reflected in updates to your LCAP federal addendum? Those two should go together because the programs they refer to as consolidated programs are the programs in your consolidated application, Title I, II, III, and IV. Those are the same programs addressed in your LCAP federal addendum. And while the addendum is only submitted to CDE once every authorization, it's supposed to be updated to reflect the LEA's current program. So question to take away would be, does your LCAP federal addendum currently reflect the Title I, II, III, and IV programs as they're currently being implemented in your district, or is it time to go back and update those and revise them? And if you do, what's the basis for making decisions about changes? And hopefully that would go back to this annual evaluation of effectiveness. And is your board informed when there are significant changes? So people say, how often should I take that to the board? Well, when there are significant program changes, then it would be a good time to take it back to your board and inform them of those changes. Next one is family engagement, and there are specific requirements for the LEA parent and family engagement policy, and one has to do with an annual evaluation. conduct with the a meaningful involvement of parents and family an annual evaluation on the content and effectiveness of your parent engagement policy. So it asks you to consider what barriers are there to parent participation, what are the needs of parents and families to support their children in learning, and what strategies are being effective in to support successful school-family interactions. The second part of that is to use the findings to design evidence-based strategies for parent involvement and also to revise the policy. So the questions on the next slide asked you to consider are, what is your LEA's process for evaluating your district parent involvement policies? And how are parents involved in that process? And which parents are involved? And how do you decide that? Is there a particular group that you have? I know some districts, when the compensatory education parent involvement requirement went away with EIA, some districts kept that group because it reflected parents of particularly Title I students. So is there a group that you have that meets that would be a good group to use? Who in your district is responsible to make sure that policy revision happens? And is it clear to the community that the results are used to revise the policy and design more effective services for parents? So time to be thinking about that. Are you annually updating that policy and involving parents in that process? Next is the school level. There's also a requirement, as you know, there's an LEA parent involvement policy, but there's also for districts a school level parent involvement policy. And that embedded in the requirements is a requirement to involve parents, again, in not only planning, but a review of the program, but also including the planning, review, and improvement of the parent and family engagement policy. So same questions. How's this taking place at school sites? Is it through your school site council? Is it through another group? How's it documented? Is it documented in minutes, discussion? How is that process taking place? So schools are annually looking at parent engagement. Next is Title III, and you can see Title III includes very detailed evaluation requirements. This is from the English Learner Instrument, EL9, and it lists significant number of requirements there, very specific about what Title III must include in terms of a program evaluation. So I refer you to our MOS unit for any questions on that, but just put on your radar, Title III is one that does have significant program evaluations. And not just that, but on the next slide is a second EL requirement, also from the instrument. And this is a requirement for an evaluation of whether your ELD program has been implemented effectively and whether any adjustments are needed to support students to overcome language barriers. So how are you evaluating your English learner programs, including your ELD program? And then finally, as Adrian mentioned, is equitable services. And the equitable services is our requirement that you need to annually assess how effective they are and how are you using the results of that of that assessment to improve services. So the thing to remember here is that the equitable services requirement is a district responsibility. And therefore, the district is the one responsible for evaluating the program annually and ensuring funded actions are effective. So services shouldn't just continue because everybody's happy with them and they like them, or the vendor does a good job selling it. It's because it's effective. And this should be discussed at the beginning of the year. So as you're doing your consultations, it's a good thing to keep in mind as you discuss activities that are going to take place at your private schools, to talk with those representatives and say, so how are we going to embed an evaluation design here so we know if this is really making a difference for your students? So some things to keep in mind as we head toward the end of the year in terms of evaluation. I noticed I saw some comments about people, maybe they embed this throughout, they're doing it different times of the year. In most cases, it just says annually. So if you're doing it annually, that's great. Just make sure you're documenting it. And most importantly, using the information to make changes for your programs. All right, and that brings us to the end, exactly on time. Our next meeting will be May 26th, same time, same place. We look forward to seeing you. I peeked in the chat. Oh my gosh, you've kept us busy. Great questions in there. We will get that the FAQs out to you as soon as possible. And we'll be putting our heads together right away to get those to you. So thanks so much for joining us. Always a pleasure to see your names out there at least. And take care, stay well, and we will see you in May, if not before. Thank you.